afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the City Club Forum. My name is Herb Camm. I'm president of the City Club. Great to see the room filled with so many supply-siders and fellow sufferers. I'm delighted to be able to tell you today that our guest is a gentleman who was described, among other things, as an econometrician. We've had economists on this distinguished platform, and we've even had electricians, but we've never had an econometrician. The City Club always is willing to accommodate you. Michael Evans, a native son of a native son. And I'm delighted also to acknowledge the presence here of his father, a member of the City Club, and assorted relatives, all of whom will be shifting, like the rest of us, the passbook from one side to the other side. Shift your wallets while you're at it, because Mr. Evans is going to make us all a lot of money, he told me. Michael Evans, really, who was here about a year ago, has developed a very enviable reputation as a man who understands what's happening in the world of economy. Since 1979, he's had his own company in Washington called the Evans Economics. He received a PhD at the Wharton School of Finance, and he also is an undergraduate, did his undergraduate and graduate work at Brown University. I'm happy to introduce to you Mr. Michael Evans, who will speak to the City Club Forum today on where supply-side economics went wrong. Dr. Michael Evans.
Thank you very much, Herb, and I'm delighted to be back at the City Club again. It seems like every time I come here, we're in a recession of some sort or another. Unfortunately, poor Mr. Reagan has become very confused by the turn of events. In fact, he was talking to a stockbroker the other day, and he said he just couldn't understand it. If he weren't president, he'd be out buying stocks right now. And the broker turned, he glared at him, he said, "Mr. Reagan, if you weren't president, so would I." But anyway, here we are in a recession, and I think the question facing us all is indeed what went wrong with supply-side economics. How do we get out of this recession? Because, to be fair about it, it was not only Mr. Reagan who has been surprised by the turn of events. If we go back and look at what economists were saying 6 months ago, of the several hundred economists who are regularly polled and give their forecast, there was not a single one that was predicting a recession for 1982. Everybody expected that the economy would do better. Now, of course, the optimists are those who say we're going to have a sluggish recovery. The pessimists think the world's going to end. So somewhere in the middle, I think we have to re-examine whether the policies that Mr. Reagan has enunciated and appears to be following through are ever going to get us out of the hole we're in. As far as my own view of the forecast goes for the economy, I suppose I'm viewed in the optimistic camp because I think the worst of the recession is over. I think the economy will recover this year, although we'll do very sluggish recovery. The unemployment rate, for example, will stay above 8%. Interest rates by the end of the year probably will be a little bit lower than they are now, maybe 1%, but not very much lower. The auto industry will recover, but will be well below the levels of 78, 79, perhaps 9 million sales, no more. The housing industry will increase to 1.2 million starts, which is well below the equilibrium level of 1.8 million. I just give these numbers as a general outlook of what I think the economy is going to do in 1982. The only bright spot on the horizon is that I think the rate of inflation will continue to diminish, and I look for inflation to average less than 7% this year. When we consider that it was 13.5% in the last year of the Carter administration, at least we're making progress on one front. I think the economy can recover in 1983 and 84, but that depends in large part on what policies are followed, not only by Mr. Reagan, not only by the Congress, but by the monetary authorities. For again, most economists would agree that the primary short-term reason that we're in another recession again is clearly the monetary tightness, the slow growth of the money supply, and the high interest rates, which we have had now really for 2.5 years, ever since Mr. Volcker took over the reins at the Fed. To get back to the main point of my remarks today, I think that in examining where supply-side economics went wrong, we have to look at what I call the 4 great myths of supply-side economics. These were the myths that were promulgated by the Reagan team which they actually believed would turn the economy around in a fairly short period of time. The first great myth is that they thought that interest rates would come down immediately in 1981, that they would come down as soon as the Reagan program was announced, never mind that it hadn't been enacted or anything like that. And because there would be such a massive shift in expectations, interest rates would drop immediately. This would lead to lower inflation. Higher growth would get the economy rolling right away. Now, this obviously turned out to be a farce. As a matter of fact, from the time that Mr. Reagan was elected until the recession started in September, long-term interest rates actually climbed 4%. So clearly, the markets did not react at all favorably to the announcement of the Reagan program. Well, after it was clear that interest rates were going to stay up for a while, the Reagan team went on to what I would call the myth number 2, and that was that we could somehow have tight monetary policy and easy fiscal policy coexisting side by side so that we would have lower inflation and rapid growth at the same time. Now, as a matter of fact, this idea was not original with the Reagan administration. It had been enunciated by who we usually consider to be the founders of supply-side economics, Bob Mundell, Drew Winitsky, and Art Laffer, as early as 1974. But it had never been seriously considered before until it was thrust in the void left by the fact that interest rates had not come down. The idea behind this, of course, was that the tight monetary policies would somehow react only on inflation and wouldn't bother real output, and then the tax cuts would generate more investment and get the economy moving. As a matter of fact, the tax cuts under ordinary circumstances would have had some positive impact on investment, but they were completely overwhelmed by the tight interest rates. I've calculated, for example, that the benefits of the tax cuts for businesses, the change in depreciation allowances and so forth, were overwhelmed by a factor of 3 by the high interest rates. The high interest rates did 3 times as much damage as the tax cuts did benefit. Under that set of circumstances, it's no surprising that investment fell off in the latter part of 81 and will show no growth in 1982. Well, when it turned out that the high interest rates and the fiscal policy were coexisting together rather uneasily, then the Reagan team came up with a great myth number 3, which was that, well, even if interest rates were high and even if business demand was sluggish, businesses would somehow invest ahead of the good news. They would invest in anticipation of all the wonderful things that the tax cuts were going to do for us over the next 3 years. Now, as a practical forecaster for almost 20 years, I've learned to be very humble and find that we really don't know very much about how the economy works. But if there's one thing that we do know, it is that without exception, investment is a lagging indicator. And by that, I mean that investment picks up only after the economy has improved, only after demand has risen, capacity utilization rates have improved, and interest rates have come down. Investment has never led the cycle, and there was absolutely no reason, except for wish, to hope that it would do so this time. So investment obviously slid down. I think the reason to give economists and forecasters some credit, although there are those who argue they don't deserve any at all these days, but to give them some credit, there was an increase in new orders from the trough of the recession in June 1980 up until the Reagan tax cut was announced in August 81. Over that period, new orders for capital spending rose 10% after adjustment for inflation. That's actually a pretty good amount. Ordinarily, in the past, a 10% increase in new orders has more or less been translated into a 10% increase in investment. And if that had happened, then we certainly wouldn't be in a recession. But what happened is that when the markets got one good look at the Reagan program, in the first 2 months after the tax package was announced, new orders declined the full 10% that they had risen over the last year, completely wiping out any of the gain and sending us back to ground zero. So that was great myth number 3 that went by the wayside. And finally, there was great myth number 4, which in some sense was the silliest one of all, and that was that the Reagan program of massive tax cuts, increases in government spending, and lower inflation could somehow balance the budget. Now, this myth had 2 problems with it. One of the problems was known as reflows. The idea of reflows are as follows. You cut taxes, and because you cut taxes, you generate an increase in economic activity. This creates more jobs, income goes up, profits go up, and so forth. And some of these extra income and profits are paid back in taxes. Well, there's nothing wrong with that theory per se, except when you get carried away to ridiculous levels and say that 100% of the tax money will come back in reflows. Unfortunately, that's what people like Jack Kemp said in the early days, although they disavow such statements now. Kemp now says the Republicans no longer worship at the shrine of the balanced budget, and some wag in Washington suggests that every Democrat is going to get a bumper sticker that says that when they campaign in '82. We'll see. But in any case, the reflows failed to materialize, and also the economists of the Reagan administration failed to take into account the fact that the decline in inflation, while it was a good thing, obviously, lessened the growth in income and lessened the growth in profits to the extent that we actually had not only zero reflows, but we had a bigger budget deficit than the original tax cut, which was entirely unexpected. The second part of this fourth myth was that somehow government spending could be cut proportional to taxes. I think congressional rule number one simply has to be that it's just one hell of a lot easier to cut taxes than it is to cut spending. There's no exceptions to that, Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. And we see that while Mr. Reagan and the Congress has stemmed the growth in government spending in real terms, the chances of them actually cutting spending are very slim. So we are saddled this year with approximately a $90 billion budget deficit, which will impede interest rates from moving down very far. So that's basically where the economy stands, and the question is, can we get out of this mess anytime in the future? Well, in this sense, perhaps I'm somewhat of an optimist, because I think that supply-side economics can work given a fair amount of time. By that I would mean 2 or 3 years. I think that basically the across-the-board tax cuts that Mr. Reagan proposed were a sound idea. I think that most of the tax cut will indeed go to saving. I think that this saving will be translated eventually into lower interest rates, and the lower interest rates will in turn eventually be translated into higher investment. Now, unfortunately, these things do not happen instantaneously. In fact, the worst mistake that the Reagan administration made from a political point of view, and one which they were clearly cautioned against doing, was to promise too much too soon. Supply-side programs take 2 or 3 years to work. They don't happen overnight. They don't happen instantaneously. And pretending that they did simply raised expectations to an unrealistic level and led to political difficulties in which the Reagan administration now finds itself. So I think that we will have, over time, 83 and 84, a decline in interest rates, an increase in real growth. But meanwhile, what do we do about this big budget deficit, which, as I've just indicated, will be about $90 billion this year? Now, recently, Bill Niskanen, who is one of the 3 members of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, delivered a paper at the American Enterprise Institute in which he said that budget deficits don't count. This was a rather amazing paper for a conservative Republican administration to be presenting. Mr. Niskanen, by the way, for those who don't know him, has been identified with his controversial views before. He worked for the Ford Motor Company as their chief economist, and he presented a position paper in which it said that the Japanese import quotas would actually harm Ford rather than help him, which happened to be 100% correct, but naturally he got fired for his pains. Now he goes to Washington, he says budget deficits don't count, and he's perhaps about to be fired. I happen to like Bill. I'm not going to say he's going to get fired, but it was not well received by the Republican hierarchy. But from a broader point of view, what did Niskanen have in mind when he wrote this paper? Now, obviously, the statement taking at face value, budget deficits don't count, clearly needs some qualification. I mean, if not, I've got the perfect solution. We cut all taxes tomorrow, and we spend as much as we want and don't worry about it. We run budget deficits of $600 billion, and everybody goes home happy. Now, that doesn't sound like a very reasonable solution. So what did Niskanen mean? He had prepared a paper in which he had showed that, in fact, if budget deficits were correlated with the rate of inflation and the rate of interest, both for the U.S. economy over the past 30 years and also for foreign economies, it was found that there was no correlation, no relationship between budget deficits and either interest rates or inflation. And he quoted, for example, which is a well-known fact, at least to economists, the fact that Germany and Japan have had budget deficits which usually average 5 or 6% of GNP, which is about double what we're looking at this year, and yet these countries have been able to contain inflation very well. Interest rates in Japan are right now about half what they are here. So obviously there is some truth in what he was saying. Also, Niskanen pointed out that in the past, budget deficits here have been associated with lower rather than higher interest rates. Just to give you one example, in 1975 and 76, we had a budget deficit which was substantially higher than it is now as a proportion of GNP. And yet, during 1976, the rate of inflation and the Treasury bill rate were both below 5%. So it can be done. However, this still needs some qualification. One of the concepts that we have to grapple with whenever we talk about the budget deficit is how much is due to inflationary increases in spending and how much is due to the fact that we're in a recession and economic activity is depressed. Because clearly, the bulk of the budget deficit which the federal government will run in 1982 is a combination of the recession, which has accounted for about $40 billion of the deficit, and high interest rates, which have accounted for another $20 billion. You take those two numbers out, and we would have had a budget deficit of $30 billion next year instead of 90, which I'm sure would leave the financial markets much closer to a state of relief. This problem is not new to the Reagan administration. It was addressed many years ago in something called the high employment budget. The idea being, what would the budget deficit be if the economy were at high employment, which is usually defined right these days maybe at 5% or 5.5% unemployment, something like that. Now, this is actually a valid concept and has been used by economists. In fact, it was highlighted by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which is otherwise considered quite a conservative institution. The trouble with the high employment budget is that, like so many other factors in life, it was devalued by Nixon when he was president. What Nixon did was he set an unrealistic target for the high employment budget, ran these huge deficits, and then gunned the economy to such an extent that it was impossible for the economy to ever reach his high employment target because the financial markets were overwhelmed. And of course, this led to our first bout with double-digit inflation, the most severe post-war recession, and of course, finally, return of the White House to the Democrats. So the high employment budget was sort of bastardized, as it were, by Nixon, but the concept is a reasonable one, and I think we have to distinguish among different deficits and try to find out how much is due. As I pointed out, about $60 billion due to the recession and high interest rates, and only $30 billion due to the remaining gap. The other thing that Niskanen found in his study was that the reason that Germany and Japan had been able to run very high budget deficits relative to GNP, and yet to keep inflation under control, was because saving in the private sector was much higher than it is in this country. And I believe that this is the critical point that we have to examine. It's not only the budget deficit that counts, but it's the total national saving rate. It's ridiculous to look at only one sector of saving, which is the public sector, and completely ignore what's been going on in the private sector. In fact, the primary reason that we've had such a spurt in interest rates over the last few years is that private sector saving has declined markedly since 1975. In the past 5 years, the personal saving rate has declined from 8% to 5%, and the corporate saving rate has declined from about 3% to 1%, partly because of the erosion of corporate profits. As a result, there has been much less saving available for the total economy. Interest rates have risen. I believe that the Reagan tax cuts basically will raise the private sector saving ratio by more than they will raise the public sector deficit. And therefore, the total national saving rate will rise, and slowly interest rates will begin to return to their historical levels relative to inflation. Ordinarily, if inflation were 7%, we would expect the prime rate and bond yields to be around 9 and 10%. As it is, they're around 14, 15%, and they're likely to stay near that range. So we have an inflation premium built into interest rates, which is probably 4 or 5% these days. And it's that premium which will diminish only slowly over time as our saving rate improves. Now, I think most people would be in favor of higher saving, higher investment, greater productivity, lower inflation. The only trouble is that in the short run, higher saving leads to lower consumption. This was proven once again in October. In October 1981, the first stage of the Reagan tax cut went into effect. And there were many economists, not only in the Reagan administration, who were predicting that the tax cut would give a boost to the economy. What happened? That's the month we went into the recession. And one of the reasons was because saving rose by $28 billion that month compared to only a $15 billion tax cut. Well, now that's overkill. Nobody is suggesting that we'll get twice as much saving as the tax cut, and things went back to normal in November. But the fact is that most of the tax cut was saved, and as a result, interest rates went down. we should have similar benefits occur in mid-1982 and mid-1983 when the second and third phases of the tax cut go into effect. So that's why I say eventually I think supply-side economics will work, but we have this short-run negative effect, which was clearly pointed out to the Reagan economists, and they simply refused to believe it because they wanted to be overage cheerleaders and didn't want to know what was really going to happen. Now, having said all that, I think we have to realize that the financial markets have become sufficiently sensitized to the budget deficits that even if the deficits are matched by private sector saving, that is the number they're going to focus on for psychological reasons, and so we have to come to grips with how we can get the budget deficits down. There are a number of ways which could be used to reduce the deficit substantially. Now, my prediction is that they will not, but I think it's necessary to at least point out what are some of the options that we have left. The nickel and diming that has gone on is pretty much all over. When they start cutting out people's subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal, you know they're not being serious. That's not the way you balance a $90 billion deficit. So we have to attack the bigger items. What are the bigger items? Well, let's look at the numbers. The single biggest item is clearly the Social Security. Now, Social Security is, as we all know, politically sacrosanct. Mr. Reagan tried to get rid of the $122 million benefit, and the sense of the Senate resolution vote against him 96-0, so he gave in on it. Well, I think it's not such a bad politician, I suppose. I think the way that has to be accomplished is not to take away benefits of existing people, but to begin phasing in fiscal solvency to the Social Security program by raising the retirement age 1 year at a time. So people who are already on Social Security would stay there, but next year the retirement age would be set at 66, the year after that 67, and so forth. Now these are big bucks numbers in the following sense, that every 1 year you raise the retirement age, that corresponds to $25 billion a year in savings by the government. And this number increases so that if you raise the retirement age to 70 by 1990, you would actually be saving $200 billion a year, just doing the arithmetic. So that's one area where the Reagan administration could begin to move. Now, admittedly, this would not help out the budget deficit this year, but I think it's fair to say that if you talk to the financial market analysts, they are not so much worried about the $90 billion deficits of 1982, which, granted, are caused by recession and high interest rates, but they're worried about the deficit ballooning out to even larger numbers as the economy recovers. Reforming the Social Security system would be one way to accomplish that. Another item, the second biggest item on the list, is defense spending. And here we run into a problem of national security, and Mr. Reagan has stated unequivocally that he won't cut defense spending. However, there's certainly redeployment of troops in Europe. There's some belief that the Europeans don't want them there anyhow, but certainly a rationalization of our troops in Europe without cutting into our muscle of defense strength would certainly be possible to save another $10 or $20 billion a year. It's an option that so far has not even been examined. The third option, and this comes on the tax side, would be to deregulate natural gas and put a windfall profits tax on it. This would raise approximately $40 billion the first year. It would be less as we go into the phasing in of deregulation anyhow, but right now it would certainly cause a substantial decrease in the deficit. This certainly would raise the price of natural gas, but it would rationalize our energy policies. It would make production, distribution of energy more efficient. For that reason, has intended side benefits. So I've suggested the reform of Social Security, redeployment of defense priorities, and an increase in natural gas taxes, which, when you add them together, comes to approximately $80 billion of the $90 billion deficit that we're facing. So when somebody says it's politically impossible to balance the budget, I don't agree with that. I say it's politically difficult, of course, but it's not politically impossible. It can be done. However, I go back on what I said a minute ago. My prediction is it will not. So given that we have a $90 billion deficit, given that we are saddled, so to speak, with the current Reagan policies and the current Volcker policies, because I doubt very much that Mr. Volcker will change his mind, particularly with Mr. Reagan standing there and cheering him on every time he raises interest rates. What do I see for the economy coming up ahead? As I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, I think 1982 will be a very sluggish year. I don't see much growth occurring until 1983. By then, with the second phase of the tax cut firmly in place, with an increase in private sector saving, I believe that interest rates will start to move down slowly, perhaps 1%, certainly not more than 2% a year, but this will be enough to spur activity in capital spending and in the housing sector. Once this happens, we'll begin to move off of our plateau of unemployment above 8%, and finally get into a full-fledged recovery, which should be starting in '83 and carrying over into '84. However, this is what I would call a half a loaf of supply-side economics. We were promised great things by the Reagan administration. We were promised that we could accomplish two goals which are thought to be in opposition to each other simultaneously. Namely, that we could have high growth and low unemployment at the same time that we could have lower inflation. Unfortunately, the new Reagan economics, the new supply-side economics, has turned out to be the old-fashioned monetarist economics, where we have the reduction in inflation by a recession and by higher unemployment. So unfortunately, the holy grail that we are looking for, faster growth in association and simultaneous with high growth and lower inflation, those two have not yet occurred. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Today at the City Club Forum, we are listening to Dr. Michael Evans addressing us on the subject, where supply-side economics went wrong. In just a minute, we'll have our question and answer session, but first I'd like to make a few announcements, and I beg your attention, please. As many of you are aware, you all should be aware, the City Club has planned a forum in Washington to take place over the weekend of February 25th, 26th, and 27th. The response to this, I tell you in all candor, has been very meager, despite the high hopes of your board of directors and your forum committee. We have an excellent chance of having the president address us in Washington. Never before, if this should take place, by the way, never before has a City Club had the honor of having a sitting president address the club. And I would think that more people who then have signed up for this trip would respond to this invitation. So I would urge all of you who are interested in making this journey to Washington on the weekend of February 25th, 6th, and 7th to make your intentions known to the club by visiting our office today, or if you want to ponder the matter a little bit longer, say 2 or 3 minutes, get back to your office and call 621-0082, which is the number of the City Club. Really, this is going to be a first-class forum, a memorable one, and historic one, for that matter. And even if we are not successful in getting the President himself, we have been assured that we will have either Secretary of State Alexander Haig I know him as well as I know my own name, which is Joe Smith, or Vice President George Bush. Now, on Wednesday noon of next week, we will begin a three-part seminar on the subject, Cleveland and Eastern Europe, Why the Ties Are So Strong. Dr. Carl Bernuti will moderate the series along with some special guests he's lined up, and we have a few places left at that table, and if you are interested in participating, please let us know today. I'm pleased, as always, to announce that we have with us at today's forum a number of high school students who attend these forums as part of our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Board of Education and a company that is planning to build a small tower on Public Square. I believe their name's Ohio. Right now we have students from the following schools: from Bay, from East High, Euclid, Lakewood, and West Tech. Would you young people kindly stand and receive our acknowledgement? They will be meeting with Dr. Evans for a seminar of their own following today's forum. Next week, our speaker will be William H. Hudnut, who is the mayor of Indianapolis and the immediate past president of the National League of Cities. And I'm told that despite the fact that his term ended on December 31st, he still has direct access to the White House. Michael, there's a man you ought to get to know. Now, I know you're all interested in whether or not interest rates are going to come down and how far, whether the stock market is going to make you any money next week or next month. Incidentally, Michael, if I may suggest and impose upon the patience of our members, I wish you would indulge us with a definition of supply-side economics. I confess I am still confused. With that, I will call upon our monitors who will accept questions. Dr. Alan Davis in the front and Bob Conrad in the rear. Microphones are handy for each and every one of you. Please make your question brief. And we will now have the first question from Bob Conrad. Dr. Evans.
Mr. Evans, if I understand you right, you expect interest to come down slightly after July 1st when the second phase of the tax cut comes into effect. But how do you stand a little further out? I recently heard Charles Schultz saying the big problem will be once growth starts back up, interest rates will start back up and will tend to shut off the further growth.
I think that Charlie Schultz's comments are sensible ones. I just don't see it happening that way. And the reason I don't see it happening that way is that I feel that there will be a much higher proportion of the tax cuts that will be saved than does Mr. Schultz, or for that matter, most economists of that generation. I think that we are going to see rather sluggish growth. Just making sure everybody's awake here. I do see a rather sluggish growth occurring in the few months after the tax cut. Your consensus forecast at the time, and not only the Reagan forecast, is for 5% growth in the second half of the year. I don't happen to believe that. I would say 2% maybe 3% if we're lucky. But the fact is that these funds will be translated into savings, and this will finally pull interest rate down, and that will get the economy going at a later date. So I think that's really the fundamental difference in our forecasts.
Dr. Evans, my two questions are directed to economists in general, those other people, not you.
Okay.
The first one was, I read somewhere that the American Economic Association was having problems. Are those due to inadequate future planning and prediction? The second question is, people that predict interest rates and stock market items could make a lot more money by keeping it a secret and investing themselves. So why would they sell these services?
Well, I had not read specifically that the American Economic Association was in trouble. I don't know what journals you read, and I won't bother to guess because I don't want to waste everybody's time. But in general, I think the presumption is that the economics profession is in trouble, not necessarily the association per se, but we're simply faced with a set of problems and a set of dilemmas which are not handled well by our current economic system. I refer primarily to the fact that because we've had two energy shocks in the past 10 years, we basically have a tax on the world economy outside of the OPEC nations, which amounts to something in the order of magnitude of $150 billion a year, and this money is shifting toward the Persian Gulf. And it's not being recycled in what we normally think of productive investment. So as a result of that, with the possible exception of Japan, the world pie is shrinking. And this is not something that economists are generally trained to explain, because when the pie is expanding, you can slice it up different ways. When it's shrinking, you have greater clashes and you have less room to maneuver. And I think that's really the problem that the economics profession is facing, and they don't have a good answer to it. As far as selling these services, I once talked to somebody who was head of a very successful financial house. He actually traded commodities. He didn't trade stocks and bonds. But anyway, this guy was somewhat of a genius at it, and he made $26 million 1 year in trading cattle futures. This is an actual fact. And I said to him, you must be nuts running this big office. Who needs it? Why don't you just trade your cattle? And he assured me that nobody can forecast correctly all the time, and that in the long run he made his money by taking commissions from other people. And that's right, and not playing his own hunches. And this guy is probably the most successful guy in the market that I ever met. So who am I to argue with success, right?
Dr. Evans, if you can assume that the personal savings rate might go up from the 5 currently to the post-war high of 8 to help meet this coming deficit of, what, 90 or 95 billion, is it conceivable that the savings rate could rise from 8 to 11 to cover the next years after that deficit of maybe 140 or 150 billion, and another deficit beyond that. And I think that's what the market is concerned about. While we'll get some improvement in savings, will there be enough improvement to cover these enormous deficits that are projected out there through '84?
Well, I would certainly agree with you that the market is worried about the rumors that the deficit will rise to $150 and $200 billion in the next 2 or 3 years, as opposed to $90 billion. I didn't have time to say this in my prepared remarks, can't cover everything, but basically, I think those stories are 100% garbage. I think they're utterly untrue, and I think that they're just scare stories, which are propagated by stockmen to sort of a club to hold over people to get cut down spending. I think it's a fundamentally dishonest way to do business, and I'm appalled at what's going on, but it's happening. That doesn't mean I have to believe this garbage. The reason I don't believe it is because, after all, we have moved from a situation where the inflation rate was 13.5% to one where it's about 8%. We have moved into a fairly severe recession, although I think it's brief. We have had a substantial increase in interest rates during a recession, which is a first, raising the interest costs of the government by $20 billion. And in spite of all this, the government deficit in the fourth quarter of '81 is only about $15 billion higher than the fourth quarter of 1980, in spite of all these bad things that have happened. There's another factor which I also didn't mention because I thought would come up in the questions, and that is that during a period of rapidly decreasing inflation, there's an artificial bulge that goes into the deficit. And the reason for that is as follows. Basically, your tax receipts are based on current revenues. If there's a drop in inflation and income and profits go down, you collect less tax receipts. But government spending, especially the part of it which is indexed, is based on last year's inflation. So in July of '81, we had this huge increase in Social Security benefits based on last year's inflation. So government spending is still running at the high rate, and it has to come down. As inflation stabilizes, this artificial bulge will disappear. So my best guess is that the deficit will peak at $90 billion this year, and that's the peak, that it will gradually begin to go down, not by enormous amounts. My forecasts are about $80 billion for fiscal '83 and about $60 billion in fiscal '84. Now, of course, I could be wrong, and in fact, there are many market participants who agree with Stockman and say that the $200 billion deficit is only a matter of time. However, as the budget numbers start to come in lower than the financial analysts expect, I believe this will have a positive effect on interest rates, and therefore it will not be necessary for the personal saving rate to rise all the way up to 11% to balance the total national saving rate. I think, to answer the first part of your question last, that 11% would be quite unlikely. I would like to see it happen, but I think it's fairly unlikely because that would imply that consumers would have to change their patterns of saving more radically than they ever did in the post-war period, and anything can happen, of course, but I consider that quite unlikely.
Dr. Evans, one thing you touched on, I'd like to have you go back and elaborate. When people compare the rate of inflation in Germany and Japan, I think it would only be fair to say one of the reasons for it, they do not have enormous defense spending, which are very inflationary. And also, would you comment on the definition that an economist is a person that's strong on theory because he's using somebody else's money?
Okay, as far as the first part of the question, and maybe by the time I get through, we'll forget the second part. Would you repeat that question again? No. It's not necessarily true that defense spending is inflationary. It depends what else is going on in the government. We have had large increases in inflation associated with big increases in defense spending in the Second World War and the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Nobody would deny that. But the reason that these increases in defense spending were inflationary was because they were not financed in other ways. They were not matched, for the most part, by tax increases. They were not matched at all by cutbacks in other areas of spending. In fact, Johnson tried to fight the Vietnam War and the war on poverty at the same time. Furthermore, even if the original Reagan numbers of a 10% growth rate in defense spending in real terms have been carried out, and those have been cut back to 5%. But even using the original numbers, and assuming that his plan were fully implemented, which it will not be, the proportion of GNP used by defense spending would go to 7% by 1985. That's just, again, doing the arithmetic. That compares to defense spending, which reached 10% the peak of the Vietnamese War, but also averaged 9% during the 1950s and the 1960s. So therefore, even if the Reagan plan had gone through, the proportion of resources devoted to national defense would have been far below the average post-war era. And because of that, and because of the fact that it's offset by cuts in other spending, I don't think that the Reagan plan for defense spending would have been inflationary. And in fact, inflation is the least of our worries. Inflation has fallen very rapidly. As far as the second part of your question, I don't know what to say. I'm using my own money on this, and perhaps that makes me even more foolish than most economists, but I'll let that pass.
Dr. Evans, Mr. Laffer says the proper therapy for the economy would be to have the tax cuts slated for 1982 and 1983 to take effect immediately. What say you?
Well, I think that the Reagan program has gotten off to a very slow start. We were supposed to have a tax cut in '81 right at the beginning. The original plan of the Reagan program was that the tax cuts would be full 10% the first year, and they'd be retroactive to the beginning of the year. So we've sort of lost the whole year. And I think what Mr. Laffer refers to is the fact that we really ought to make up for lost time, that we ought to adhere more closely to the original timetable of the Reagan program. I think you have to balance the economics and the politics of it. In other words, from a strictly economics point of view, I think moving the tax cuts up would speed along the progress of supply-side economics, lower interest rates, higher saving. But that has to be balanced, in my view, against the political viewpoints. And I think that a lot of the pure supply-siders have failed to come to grips with the fact that the financial markets have become increasingly sensitized to the size of the budget, and the psychological reaction simply cannot be ignored. And so, on balance, I would say the psychological reaction of the financial markets in pushing interest rates much higher, which I feel confident would occur if the tax dates were to be moved forward, would overwhelm the economic effects, which, as I've just described, are very slow acting. And so, for that reason, I'm not in favor of moving the tax cuts up. I'd prefer to let them stand as they currently are.
Dr. Evans, I don't know if you feel that coming down of the interest rates is the most important thing to get the economy going. On the other hand, 10 to 20% of the money available by the federal government is taken by large corporations to buy other companies, and this way don't produce more work or more industrial growth. It's just taking money which they loan themselves and buy other organizations, which I don't think it's should be allowed.
Well, the trouble with not allowing it is that you have to set up arbitrary rules, which I think are counterproductive. I don't think that the buying of Marathon Oil by U.S. Steel accomplishes anything. It doesn't increase the number of jobs and so forth. But I would offer the counter-argument that the reason that these firms are going out and buying existing assets instead of building new ones is because interest rates are so high and the stock market so depressed that from a rational point of view, from the tunnel vision of the individual company, that's the best thing to do with their money. If interest rates came down and the stock market went up, it would then become cheaper and more profitable to expand rather than to simply buy existing companies. So I see the high interest rates as part of the problem. That's another dimension of the problem. If interest rates came down, I think we'd see less of these mergers.
Dr. Evans, everyone is interested in the future of the American automobile industry. You've indicated some improvement in auto sales later on this year. As you know, one company, American Motors, has joined with Renault, a French car maker, for the future. Do you see future associations with American companies and foreign car makers?
Okay, well, I predicted an increase in the auto industry, but really not a very big one. The 9 million units, which I referred to in my remarks, includes both domestic and foreign sales, and foreign sales right now take about a quarter, so that would bring the domestic industry in at about 6.8 million. Now, the auto industry is currently set up so that they have to produce, or they say they have to produce 8 million cars a year in order to reach decent profit levels. Now, I don't think the auto industry is going to reach 8 million cars a year for a long time. They may hit it in a couple of peak quarters, but over the long run, that's not going to happen. The auto industry market is shrinking. The demographics are moving against it. The cost of fuel is moving against it. The change in lifestyle is moving against it. And so the auto industry is simply going to have to shrink its size. And receiving infusions of capital from foreign sources will not help their problems of having to shrink in size, nor will it help their problems of being priced out of the world markets by paying labor more or less $8 an hour more than they're paid in Japan. The way I see the auto market going is that the companies will shrink down in size, that foreign trade relations, import quotas, whatever you want to call them, will force more European and Japanese companies to build their cars, or at least to assemble their cars in this country. And I think we will see more of that. But as far as foreign investors putting money into the big three that are remaining, I think that the foreign investors can see as clearly as domestic investors that this is a bad bargain, this is a shrinking industry. If we have money to invest in America, we'll put it in telecommunications or computers or something sexy and exciting and leave those poor old auto companies to die in peace.
Dr. Evans, one significant tax cut which is just now going into effect is this individual retirement account. And this would encourage, I would think, savings. If you couple that with what you predict will be a continuing decreasing rate of inflation, this too, it would appear, would be a tremendous incentive for savings, because people would get away from the buy now because it'll cost more later syndrome. Is it possible that these two things working together at the same time, there might be far more increase in the savings rate than might even be projected? How do you see these as extremely significant when working together?
Well, I think the IRAs are very significant. In fact, I did the work from the testimony before the Ways and Means Committee last year, so I did come up with some estimates at the time. And what I found was that the net effect of the expansion of the IRAs would be to increase personal saving by approximately $18 billion, which was more or less 1 percentage point on the savings rate. Now, this won't all happen immediately. It won't even happen all in 1982, but after 2 or 3 years when people get used to the ideas, I think it will raise the personal saving rate by 1 full percentage point. And I've figured that into my calculations. Now, it could be that these numbers, by the way, are based on what happened when IRAs were originally introduced in 75, 76. And I think that perhaps by expanding them to everybody, advertising them, we could get even a larger effect. But my best estimate would be about a 1 percentage point increase in the saving rate. And that is taken into account in my forecast that interest rates will come down and that savings will increase, which, as people have already pointed out, is somewhat more optimistic toward saving and pessimistic toward consumption than most of the forecasts that are circulating anyhow.
Dr. Evans, one reads that the money supply growth in 1981 has actually been less than the Federal Reserve had targeted. And yet when the short-term rates went up the last 2 months, people seem to be speculating that the Fed is going to tighten its credit policy. Are these fears misplaced, and what do you see for the short-term interest rate, say for the first half of '82?
Well, the answer to that has several parts. First of all, it is in fact the case that the growth of the aggregate that the Fed follows, which is called M1B shift, increased to 2.4% last year, which was well below the lower end of the target range, which was set from 3.5% to 6%. However, the Fed does things in a very funny way in setting the targets, which is that the target is always based on the fourth quarter of last year. History starts anew every beginning of the calendar year, and the reference point is the fourth quarter of last year. Anything that's happened in the past is ancient history, which has no bearing on Fed policy. So suppose, for example, that the money supply had fallen 5% last year. I mean, it didn't, but suppose it had. Even if that were the case, the Fed would then disregard that information, and they would look at the growth of the money supply in the first half of this year relative only to the fourth quarter of 1981. That's simply the way it's done. And because the money supply started to increase rapidly in the fourth quarter, which, by the way, was due to faulty seasonal adjustment and had nothing to do with the real world, but that's another point, because it happened that way, people realize that the Fed will be looking only at the last few months, and if the rate of increase of the money supply continues, that would clearly signal more tightening. Now, the second part of your question, will it happen? No, it will not happen. There's a money supply number which will come out today at 4 o'clock. That money supply number will be a very large increase of $4 to $6 billion for technical reasons having to do with the fact that January 1st was a holiday, which is not worth boring anybody about, and the market knows about it. But once this $4 to $6 billion increase comes out, then the money supply will reverse the sharp increases which occurred over the last 2 months, and money supply growth, the M1 statistic that the Fed follows, will in fact decline over the next 2 or 3 months. Again, mainly because of technical and statistical factors, although partly because the economy is weak. But the net effect is it will decline, and after this happens for 2 or 3 weeks, the markets will adjust to it, and short-term interest rates will go down to about the level that they reached in early December. After that, as I've indicated in my remarks, they'll probably not change much at all over the year.
Dr. Evans, yesterday in New York, President Reagan turned to David Rockefeller to reassure him that he wasn't going bankrupt. And
who turned to who? Forget it. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
When the president gives reassurance, you know, tomorrow he will give reassurance. And he is quoted in this morning's Times, if I can beg the pardon of the local papers. If America can increase its savings rate by just 2 percentage points, we can add nearly $60 billion a year to our capital pool to fight high interest rates, finance new investments, and get new jobs. Do you agree with that?
Well, the numbers are essentially correct. If we increase our saving rate by 2%, that's the sort of magnitude we'll get. And I think that eventually the statement stands pretty much without needing to be modified. The point I would make is that this process does not happen overnight. That if the savings rate were to go up by 2% tomorrow, just to use an example, the first effect on it would be to decrease consumption, which would make the recession worse. Eventually, the higher saving would be translated into lower interest rates and higher investment, higher productivity, which would indeed create the new jobs. So if we're talking about a time horizon of 3 or 4 years, I would agree with that statement without having to modify it. But the problem is that people often don't have that long a time horizon, and when the economy goes sour in the first year, as it certainly has under Reaganomics, they then tend to look askance at the whole program. I would say one other thing, which is that rather glowing forecast which you just read will come true if and only if the monetary authorities cooperate. It is always possible, as Mr. Volcker has proved not once but 3 times since his tenure as chairman of the Fed, it is always possible for the monetary authorities, if they are so disposed, to choke off any growth in the economy which is occurring for any other reason. So we have to have a greater cooperation between monetary and fiscal authorities.
Mr. Evans, my question concerns space research. Why are there budget cutbacks in NASA and in space research when a strong space program would be in our national interest as a nation and also for the free world?
I'm not in favor of the NASA cutbacks. I'm not in favor of several of the cutbacks that are going forth. In fact, I think several of the cutbacks that the Reagan administration has taken will come back to haunt us. The neglect of the railroads is another one. The cutbacks in grants and aid that go to cities and state governments, which have resulted in the collapse of the infrastructure of the cities, is a third one. I'm not in favor of any of these. I think that government spending, which is made for investment purposes, certainly is useful, and in many times more useful than investment which is made by the private sector. If we don't have an infrastructure, we don't have much of an economy left after a while. Now, NASA isn't infrastructure per se, but I strongly feel that the research and development work, which was done on the space program, not necessarily having some guy walk around the moon, that didn't do anything for me, but the stuff that came out of it, the miniaturization, the microcomputers, the electronic transmission distribution of information explosion, is going to play a very important role in technological progress of the U.S. economy in the 1980s. And I think the cutbacks, not only NASA, but in investment by the government, are a mistake.
With respect to the national debt,
there's a school of economists who believe that the national deficit really doesn't mean anything as long as the people have confidence in the money. That once the people lose confidence, then you're in real trouble. Do you agree with that?
Well, unfortunately, the people have lost confidence in the money. They started to lose confidence in the money, I would estimate, probably around 1977, in which they moved massive amounts of assets out of money and into anything which was in fixed supply. It could have been real estate, it could have been gold and silver, it could have been oriental rugs, Chinese ceramics, paintings, whatever you have. But the point is that they did move out of money because they figured that the rate of inflation was going to continue to accelerate indefinitely, and unfortunately there was not a great deal of evidence to contradict them. The reason that they moved out probably didn't have that much to do with the national debt. The national debt as a proportion of GNP is about 1/3. After the Second World War, it was over 1, and yet the people have more confidence in the money. So the national debt per se is not the critical element. The element is whether people believe that inflation is under control. If they do, they'll basically put their money into productive assets, bonds, stocks, or either directly or through financial intermediaries. But if they don't, and they put it in fixed assets, the money flows out of the productive process, inflation gets worse, in a sense it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Dr. Evans, what is your opinion of the administration cutting back of social program funding? Do you consider that a hatchet job, or does it make sense to you as an econometrician?
Well, I think the cutback in social programs has so far been a mixed bag. There are several cases where welfare fraud was uncovered, where people went back in jobs and turned out they were happier about it. There's also been other cases where the cutbacks have actually hurt poor people, have resulted in people actually having less to eat and so forth. I think that some pruning of the programs was overdue. And the reason I say that is because the programs had been enlarged to include those people who were never considered to be part of the programs, even by the original liberal backers of the program. You look back and see what people like Hubert Humphrey and others said when they passed the program, and they did not expect them to cover the current scope that they had. In that sense, I think pruning was judicious because it returned the laws to the original scope for which they were intended. Now, unfortunately, the job has been sort of taken with a bludgeoning atmosphere. Mr. Stockman there evidently never got over the fact that the federal government money actually paid for some tennis courts in his hometown, and he's out to prove that that was a mistake. And so he's cutting back in a very hard-hearted fashion. I think that's a mistake. But in general, without trying to equivocate on this, some pruning of the programs is overdue. I just think it should have been done a little more carefully.
One more question.
One more question.
Dr.
Yes.
Evans, you indicated that one of our immediate problems was the high interest rates, and this would be somewhat remedied by an increase in the savings. Now, we know that people are beginning to put money into IRAs and other accounts, and some of these accounts have duration of 2 to 10 years, and they're at 14% interest. What is the effect of that going to have on the interest rates?
Well, we don't have much time to answer the question. Some of the accounts have been locked in for interest rates that are fixed in duration. However, most have not. If you put your money in a money market fund, the rate is obviously variable. If you believe that inflation interest rates are going to come down, what you want to do is you want to buy bonds now, get the 14% in the capital gains. If you think interest rates are going to go up, you want to get in the money market funds with the short term. And I think my time is up.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. The City Club Forum is adjourned.